Thank you. I'd just like to say thank you so much for inviting me to here today. I mean, I'm just delighted to be able to come across to Ireland and speak a bit about our experiences. And I think, you know, last night we went out for dinner and I began to understand a little of perhaps, you know, some of the different sort of things that have happened in the UK that have enabled us to get some of this kind of work off the ground. And Liz mentioning the Strategies for Living work, which was actually my very, very favourite piece of work ever. That was really enabled, nothing to do with services, nothing to do with academia. That came through the voluntary sector with money from the lottery. And we had some really good people involved in it, but it did come from the voluntary sector. And hopefully, and there were another, you know, a few other sort of initiatives like that I think helped to move and push things to change. So to say a bit about myself, I first of all, I became a researcher in mental health many years ago. I worked for National Mind. That would be in about mid-80s. And we did some work on looking at Section 136 of the Mental Health Act, which is the section under which people can be taken by the police from a public place to what they might call a place of safety, which would usually be either a police station or a psychiatric hospital. And it's still very much a live debate today, that particular section of the Mental Health Act. I mean, most of them are, but that one is of particular interest to people. And we used to go, I mean, I interviewed quite a lot of police officers during that time, and also quite a lot of psychiatrists. It was great, actually. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I went into the police station at Tottenham at a time when things were really quite politically really difficult, and so we had some interesting experiences. But what we couldn't do was interview very many patients. I would go into the hospital with my little briefcase, you know, hoping to interview people in hospital who had just been picked up under the section, and oddly enough, they weren't that keen to talk to me. And I've since sort of found myself thinking, you know, there are better ways of doing this kind of research. I mean, that particular research had ethical approval and everything. It had gone through all the proper channels, but also what it hadn't done was to think very clearly, I think, about how to do research that really would engage people in doing that, you know, really well and ethically in a different way, using the word ethics in a different way. And during the course of my own experience of using services, I've certainly had the experience of being in an inpatient ward when somebody wanted to come and interview me for their research, and that was quite interesting as well. I mean, I was quite interested in that idea of convergence, and bringing together service users and practitioners and academics in research. Sometimes it can work really well, and sometimes it's incredibly difficult to do it, actually. And I mean, one of the big advantages of the Strategies for Living research was we were doing it for ourselves. It was very much about service users saying, okay, well, what do we find helpful in the world? And it may be that part of that is mental health services, but it's also lots of other things that we also, people came up with. So one of the things that I thought, you know, what do we mean by user involvement in research? And that's one of the terms that we tend to use an awful lot in the UK, user involvement in research. I think Jan is going to talk much more about some of the more radical aspects of survivor research. But I thought I'd start here because that's where it kind of, in some ways, begins. Active involvement. I mean, this quotation is from some of the work of an organisation called Involve, and they were set up by the Department of Health in about the mid-90s to promote and encourage, at the time, I think, consumers in research, and they've since changed their focus slightly, but they are still there, very powerfully sort of promoting and encouraging public involvement in research. So it's not just mental health, but they produce a lot of free publications, and sort of a lot of very practical things to try to break down the sort of boundaries, if you like, barriers between academics and service users, consumers, carers, you know, just generally trying to move towards something that we might call more convergent research. I like this, I'm going to use that one now. So we're very much thinking about people taking an active role in influencing research, and perhaps I'm talking to people who already know about this, but I'm certainly thinking about very active involvement in research, people being part of advisory groups. They might, sometimes sitting on an advisory group can be an incredibly unpowerful thing to do. I've had that experience, and maybe many other people have too. It's often not where things actually take place in an advisory group. The real research is going on somewhere else, and you just come along and sit occasionally and talk about it. But it's much more, I think, exciting to get involved in doing something more practical. One of the things that I often do these days, since I became freelance, is to work with a group of service users to train them in some basic research skills, interviewing skills, sometimes analysis and report writing, and to therefore enable them to take part in a research project. That's something that I will talk about a little bit more in a minute, but I mean that's the sort of thing that I often get involved in doing these days. But broadly speaking, you might think of a continuum. So you might think of a user-controlled rather than user-led, but I've just put user-led for the time being because it's shorter. At one end of a continuum, at the other end you might have something like consultation, and somewhere in the middle there is this other thing called involvement or collaboration. And as I say, I would say that strategies for living was somewhere towards that end of the continuum, the user-led, user-controlled end of the continuum. And in the middle here we have a whole range of different things that we might call collaboration. And it can be, it can be so very much professional or researcher-led at this end, or it can be very much a service user sort of taking very much part of the power, part of the control for a bit of the research. So it can be, there are lots of different ways in which it can happen, and I am going to, as I say, just talk about a few examples of it. One of the things that some people ask is why bother? Why do we want to involve service users in research? And I think there are lots of different reasons. I mean, I've listed a few here, and I was looking at them this morning, and I think some of them sort of overlap a bit. But I mean, I think one of the key things that we feel, I was listening to the person who introduced it. I was thinking about applied research. I did a master's in applied psychology, and I thought, actually, yes, of course, I've always been interested in applied research. It's always been a part of, what I think research should be about, is about changing things for people, not about ivory towers. But I suspect that there is an argument for a small ivory tower somewhere, maybe.